Camille, I try and do this with the guests on the podcast. To give me a sense of where they're from, like before they became a public figure, before they became an adult. Like, what's your background? Where were you born? How you grow up? And how did that? I want to ask, how did your politics emerge out of that, if it did at all?
Mm. Well, I always feel a bit odd telling this story because I wish it was more interesting. I'm a first generation American. My family is from the Caribbean. I grew up in and around DC. Went to school at University of Maryland College Park after going to various public high schools and etc. And I majored in government and economics after initially thinking I might be a biochemist. Spent about a year pursuing that and switched majors. And
But your
I
folks are
actually
where
built
in the Caribbean?
Jamaica.
Both your parents
Yeah.
are from Jamaica?
Yes, yes. Although my biological father, we didn't have much of a relationship. When I came here, my mother was young, pregnant, and single. And my stepfather, someone she met when I was around 2 years old. And I actually think my dad, as I called him all my life,
This is your
had a
stepdad.
pretty profound impact on my thinking, specifically about myself and my own identity. Because he wasn't someone who was trapped by notions of sort of race. And he was someone who was particularly, I think, uniquely liberated from the perspectives of other people with respect to who he was.
Tell me more
And it
about
was
him.
something that he really tried to cultivate in me. Well, he's a guy who played football in Washington, D.C. He went to, he was a member of the Washington Stonewalls and went to high school in a period of time before Brown v. Board of Education. So he ended up playing while like semi-pro football while the NFL was still segregated.
Mm.
And, growing up in that time, I think despite his experience was very much the sort of person who, for the most part, he had his limitations in this way. But for the most part, just judged people on the basis of who they were. And expected that other people would do the same for him. And what was really important was, cultivating a reputation for being the kind of person that does that and ensuring that I understood how important it was to be my own person, to be autonomous with respect to my own thinking and to not buy into other people's perspectives of what I ought to do or
And
what
that
I
was
ought to think.
that was partly about being black in America.
I think it was more, but that's just it. For him,
Mhm.
it was just, being me, decidedly and distinctly me. And I think I try to make certain that that's something that I manifest in all areas of my life. As I've grown up and as I've become someone who talks in public, I frequently find myself coming into conflict with ideas about race and identity. And it's primarily because for myself, for all of the same reasons I just outlined, I don't feel confined by notions of race
And you
and
weren't brought
identity.
up
I
that
don't
way.
identify as Black in that way. Right. And, I think it's something that really had to evolve because it wasn't so much that my father would say to me, Camille, you're not a Black man. His thing was, you're Camille. And that's what's really important here. And wherever you go, you need to represent yourself in a way that, comports with how much you respect yourself and how much you want others to respect you, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems to me that most of our contemporary ideas about race today are things that are oftentimes incompatible with that, especially as we've gotten into what I think maybe we could describe it as this particularly uniquely identitarian moment where people, for noble reasons, think it's a good idea to wrap themselves in their racial identity and confront notions of racial identity that exist, and establish new standards and ideas about equity related to race and the distribution of goods and services and rights, et cetera, in our lives. So
So
I've
you were
got some
always
unusual ideas about that.
right. So you were kind of brought up into individualism as an idea, like that was the most important thing, which must have meant in America. Well, how did your parents? Forgive me if I'm prying, but I just find it fascinating because a lot of people have said to me that in discussing race in America, I'm at a very deep disadvantage in not having grown up here.
Uh-huh.
And I think I am. At the same time, I also think there is sometimes an advantage to not being completely marinated in the culture, to see some of its craziness, some of the
Mhm.
assumptions that you sort of, well, why? Why are you saying that? But was the Jamaican nature of your parents like that? Because that's a slightly different experience. The Jamaican immigrant experience is different than, descendants of slaves, or other kinds of African American experiences. Was that a factor in this?
I'd say it was decidedly important with respect to how my ideas have evolved. I've always said that Jamaicans have this ability to be conveniently Black. They can, in different circumstances, identify as Black people. But growing up in my household, where when we first came to the country, in a house with my mom, my grandmother, I think two of my uncles are living in the house, and my grandfather, and everyone is in the area. There was a very real sense of our Jamaicanness and of native born Black people's sort of otherness. And I think it's born out of a lot of different things and it's complicated, but most people who are the first generation Blacks, whether they be from, Africa or Jamaica, probably share some sensibility about that and even have some kind of animosity towards other groups, that may kind of look like them. So that put me outside of the conventional Black experience and at least gave me the inclination to be skeptical of certain aspects of it or
And
to not
Jamaica,
be
Jamaica,
trapped by it with respect to how I think about issues.
Jamaica's very socially conservative as well. Was that part of your father's worldview?
Well, actually, my father was born here.
All
So
right.
my dad was here. My biological father, very much a Jamaican guy, grew up in Jamaica, but
Okay.
I just really didn't know him
Yeah.
at all. Um, but it's certainly true that there's this conservative thing about Jamaicans. But growing up, I was mostly a default Democrat who didn't give much thought to public policy issues. You grow up and you're told that Ronald Reagan sucks the marrow out of babies' bones, and you believe it. You just presume it to be true.
Was that really what
And
you were taught? I mean, he was a
essentially,
demonized
like
figure.
these people are all racist monsters. That's pretty
Right.
much it.
So even though you were brought up, in a very Jamaican African American context, the
Hmm.
notion of omnipresent racism was still there in your head from the very beginning. Did you
This is. Mhm.
did you encounter it? Did you see this in your own life, or was that process a more complicated thing?
I can certainly say that I've had some encounters with actual racism. Before we moved to Maryland, I lived in Ashburn, Virginia, which it became very well known globally because it was a hub for a lot of early internet companies, network companies in particular. But when I lived there, it was mostly farms. And the school I went to, I was one of two Black kids. And I can remember distinctly playing with a little girl across the street and getting into a situation where she says to me, I can't play with you anymore because my daddy says I can't play with niggers. And the only thing I know after that is I go home, I tell my parents I was slightly confused by this.
How old were
And my
you?
dad goes across the street, maybe 8 or 9,
Okay.
but my dad goes across the street and talks to her dad, and that was the last of it. Beyond that, was I treated differently in class on account of my Blackness? I don't know. To the extent it's true, again, the what I was being taught at home was, go out and be great, be remarkable,